Okay, so I was watching on the ISFJ board on Facebook, and this girl says, given that ENTP is our shadow type, how does that play in your life? And I told her that the ENTP is not your shadow type. It's actually the ENTJ is your shadow type, and she told me no, it wasn't. But I tried to explain to her, but it's not easy to explain on type, but that's actually how you find your duality. See, the ISFJ dominant and auxiliary roles are the SIFE, and these actually have to stay grouped in these twos right here. And see, the ESFP, SIFE, TINE looks like their shadow would be exactly the shadow of the ISFJ, but it's not, because this is your dominant and this is your auxiliary role. Down here, this is your, see how the SIFE, the ENTJ is actually the duality of the ISFJ. And you can see that to find out the cognitive processes of the ENTJ, all you have to do is write these processes backwards. So SIFE, TINE, SEFI, TENI. See? And you get your duality. You can't just write it. See, see, that looks like they have this, their shadow is your dominant, but it's not, because these two, these in the middle are your mid roles, where these two are your dominant and these two are your weakest, and so they have to match up. Your shadow functions actually read a little bit backwards, see? So when doing, if you go to cognitive process, it'll explain this a little bit better, but you have to, you can't just say, oh look, their shadow looks just like my dominant. So shadows don't read forward when it comes to duality. So if you look at the ESFJ and the INTJ, same down here, because you know these two are dualities. So to find out theirs, I group these together, FE, SI. Oh, what's theirs? Down there. NETI, or NITE or something. NETI. See, it crosses more like an X across. You can't just read it straight over. Because, the reason for that is because this is your deceiving and devilish role. But that deceiving role turns into your dominant, and the devilish turns into your auxiliary when you get into your, and so it has to cross over perfectly like this. This right here is your opposing role, and this is your critical parent role. These cross over into being your relief role and your aspirational role. See, these four in the middle are kind of like the relief role on the ends of these. These are your most dominant on the ends, and these two in the middle kind of second these. And so you can't say these, because these four read just like these four, that they are your shadow. They're not your shadow. This is your shadow. It has to read in twos. Sorry, it's kind of hard to do this backwards. In twos, and it has to read backwards. You can't just read it, because if you actually were to look at the cognitive processes and read them, you'd understand that you just can't read it forward like that and say, oh, my first four make their last four, because you're actually, to get your duality, you have to read it backwards. And on my cognitive wheel, in my earlier videos, I actually showed that on my cognitive wheel. One, how to find your duality, because the easiest way to find your duality, ISFJ, well then that would be an ENTJ, because these last letters will always stay the same in your duality partner, but the first three change the exact opposite. So the ESFP will never be the duality or the shadow function of the ISFJ, because it doesn't read like that, if you know. So if you read on it, you have 8 different cognitive processes. So you have your leading role, which is your dominant, your supporting role, which is your auxiliary, your relief role, and your aspirational role. So you have your first, second, third, and fourth functions. But they group together like this. So your first and second come together, and your third and fourth come together. They read like that. They come together like that. And so you can't, when they cross over into the shadows, it's kind of weird to explain why, just because somebody's shadow looks exactly like yours, your first 4, it's not, because it has to read backwards. It has to, not exactly backwards, and 2's backwards. So yeah, if you go to cognitiveprocess.com, they actually explain it all more into depth. I'm not going to sit here and read it on my video. You can actually go to Cognitive Process yourself and read more on the 8 roles and see why they have to be coupled that way. And when you find your duality, you find out why they're truly your shadow, because your shadow function is somebody who functions exactly the opposite of you. Their weakest point is literally your strongest, your natural point, because your supporting, your auxiliary role and your dominant role that are easy for you to slip into so easy, this is just second nature to you, has to be in their shadow function, is their worst roles. So see, in the ESFP, this isn't their worst role. This is not. These middle 2 aren't your worst. These aren't what you're the worst or the best at. These are what kind of just follow as a little bit of a third nature kind of thing. It's your third and fourth functions, your fifth and sixth functions. You don't use them as much because and that's why the ISFJ and the ESFJ lack a lot of logic, is because when you tap into our shadow functions, there's your thinking and intuitive ability, the extroverted thinking and the introverted intuition that dominates people like the INTJ that naturally think logical, and this is what makes that INTJ impersonal. This is what makes them think logic before feelings. But feelings don't come second nature to them. They're actually right there in their secondaries. And so me as an ESFJ, this is what I naturally flow to. They don't, my INTJ, I've been teasing him lately because when he watches a movie and he gets a little bit shaky during emotional moments, I tell him, I'm like, just let it happen. Just feel it. Just go with it. Just let it happen. Because to an INTJ, to feel that shadow function, to actually let emotion flood in from watching a scene and actually go in there and relate emotionally instead of logically to something, is, as he describes, it just doesn't feel right. It's unnatural. Because your shadow function will feel unnatural to you. And your devilish and your deceiving role will feel the most unnatural to you. However, used in a positive light, they can feel better. And cognitive processes, if you kind of understand it, they do explain a little bit more about how even your auxiliary role and your dominant role can actually be negative in your life and everything. And so I recommend going to Cognitive Process and kind of studying up on you and your duality, and you kind of learn a little bit more about how your duality functions and what it's like to literally live in your shadow, because their last 4, and I'm not talking, it can't be like this, their last 4 falls in the exact same line as your first 4. It has to fall backwards like this. It has to cross over like an X. So it has to be these 2 have to cross over with these 2 like this. It has to be backwards compatible X's. It can't be straight down, diagonal, no X's, no crossing, just straight. It can't be that way, because this is your true shadow. Right here is your true shadow. These last 2 are your true shadow of your first two. These middle two are the shadow of these two. And so they mirror image each other. You can't, these are not your shadow, even though it may look like it, because it reads the same as, shadows read backwards. They don't read forwards. So, but if you read up on your duality, you would see how that makes sense a little bit more, how it reads backwards. Wesley! What are you crying about? Come here, buddy. So anyways, that's a little bit more about that. I just, no point in arguing with an ISFJ. She's not liking what I'm having to say. But it's really, really hard to explain. Really hard to explain. But anyways, thanks for watching my YouTube channel. I'll post that up there. Go to cognitiveprocess.com. Learn a little bit more about your cognitive processes and your duality. And remember that it doesn't read straightforward. It reads a little bit of backwards in twos, though you have to couple them at twos. And when you apply it to the cognitive wheel, which I show you, you can look up the color cognitive wheel and Google it. And look up that cognitive wheel. Use it. Look at my first videos that I made a year ago that explain that cognitive wheel. And I'll explain to you a little bit more how to use that cognitive wheel, and you can actually see how the first two functions are coupled together, and you cannot rearrange them any other way. And so, yeah, I'll have to break out the cognitive wheel a little later. I don't know where it ran off to, but anyways, use the cognitive wheel. Go Google the color cognitive wheel. You'll find it, and it'll help you understand the cognitive process in your shadows, and it'll help you see how you have to still keep those coupled together as your shadows. Anyways, thanks for watching my videos. Hope you guys enjoy them.
Shadow.